Good morning. Good morning and welcome. In typical Santa Cruz fashion, it's about 10 minutes after 9. We're going to start a little late. There's additional seating upstairs for those people who can't find a seat downstairs. Again, welcome and good morning. We couldn't ask for better weather on Leap Day. My name is George Jarrow, and I'm the Director of Behavioral Health Services at Dominican Hospital, and I'm also the chair of the symposium. Inside your packet today, you're going to find an agenda, and behind the agenda is a list of program notes. We've tried to be really careful to outline all the basic things. Cell phones, bathrooms are well marked. We have the whole upstairs of this building today, and there's going to be a flow of traffic that we're going to want to deal with. It is a full day. We're starting here about 9, and we're going to be finishing at 4. Lunch will be in the sunroom, is where you're going to get your lunch, and then you're going to come back out to the various tables, and we're going to try to do things promptly. As you can see, we're starting at 9:15. No, there's no program notes. What I meant to say was there's instructions about what you can and can't do or should do, that kind of stuff, and you can figure it out. Community Television of Santa Cruz will be recording this event for future broadcast, and I think that's great because, you know, the entire community gets to see this very special event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Joshua Nadherny Calciano.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I just want to welcome everyone to our 10th annual symposium. Our family is incredibly gratified to have seen the symposia in memory of our son and brother Jon develop over the years into the widely attended event today. Jon was 23 years old when he passed away, and as difficult as our loss continues to be, the coming of the community coming together to help prevent similar tragedies is a very healing force. Our appreciation goes out to all those who have helped develop the initial concept, contributed to the funding, and planned the details of each annual symposium. We are particularly gratified to have all the volunteers, both on the advisory committee as well as the Dominican Hospital Guild. We could not continue to have such wonderful symposias year after year without you. We continue to be impressed by literally thousands of attendees, clinicians, counselors, educators, parents, and public safety officials who have day-to-day contact with young people. Those that have attended the symposium over the years, and the post-symposium comments and the number of attendees that return year after year clearly show that we are making a real impact on our community. We invite all those interested in helping to provide our local youth with a healthy behavioral environment and the best possible support systems to join us in this and future symposiums. Nothing could be a better tribute to my brother, Jon. Thank you. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Siegel. Dr. Daniel Siegel received his medical degree from Harvard University and completed his postgraduate medical education at UCLA with training in pediatrics and child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. He served as a National Institute of Mental Health Research Fellow at UCLA, studying family interactions with an emphasis on how attachment experiences influence emotions, behavioral, autobiographical memory, and narrative. Dr. Siegel formerly directed the training program in child psychiatry and is the recipient of teaching awards and honorary fellowships as well as professorships. He is currently an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine, where he is on the faculty of the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. He is also the director of the Mindful Institute, an educational organization that focuses on how the development of insight and empathy within individual families and communities can be enhanced by examining the interface of human relationships and basic biological processes. Dr. Siegel is the author of the internationally acclaimed text, The Developing Mind, Towards a Neurobiology of Interpersonal Experiences, which introduces the idea of interpersonal neurobiology as a way of defining the mind and mental well-being. This approach is further explored in the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology, of which Dr. Dan Siegel is the founding editor. His book with Mary Hartzell, Parenting from the Inside Out, How a Deeper Self-Understanding Can Help You Raise Children Who Thrive, explores the application of this newly emerging view of the mind, the brain, and human relationships in families. He is currently finishing 2 texts, Mindsight and The Mindful Brain in Psychotherapy, which also expand these applications into the areas of everyday life and psychotherapy. His current educational programs can also be viewed at his website, drdansiegel.com, and you can also find a link on our website, Calciano Youth Symposium. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Siegel.
Good morning. It's a distinct honor to be here on this 10th anniversary lecture in honor of Jon Nadherny Calciano. And I really want to extend my appreciation to the family for giving me this honor and for allowing me to really honor the memory of Jon and to talk about health and well-being. So thank you very much. And Joshua, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Can you hear all right? All right? Okay, if you need me to speak louder, just let me know. Though my adolescents at home say you speak loud enough. So if I'm speaking too loud, tell me to. Today we're going to be talking about a number of things related to what it means to be human. And to do that, we are going to dive into a number of areas that you have in the outline, and let me just go over that with you so we're on the same page, which is, in fact, just one page. The first segment will be discussing the idea of what is the human mind, how does it relate to the brain, and how do the mind and brain relate to our interpersonal relationships. So we'll be discussing mind, brain, and relationships. Then we'll have some time for questions and discussion and take a break, and then go into this notion of mindful awareness and look at its correlation with certain aspects of brain function and how there may be a very important universal way that we can develop the mind that promotes well-being in our relationships, in our bodies, and in our minds themselves. Then we'll take another break after questions, and then come back after lunch and discuss other issues such as how do we promote resilience through this process of developing the mind with reflection, and then looking at something which will sound kind of abstract at this point called neural integration, and how that relates to well-being, and how the impairment to neural integration can lead to various impediments to well-being. So that's our overall schedule. What we have is a mic on the side. So if you do have questions, I'll let you know ahead of time when we're going to take a break. And we thought the most efficient use of time would be for people to come up to the mic and be able to ask questions that way. Okay, so to start with, we're going to look at the most basic of ideas. And how many of you in the beautiful ballroom we have here at the Coconut Grove are working in a way that helps other people develop? Okay, so there we go. So it looks like most of us. Now you may say, well, doesn't every profession do that? Well, you probably can name a few where they don't. But if we're in education, we work with people who are developing and want to help them move in a way we'd consider positive. If we're psychotherapists or in any field of mental health related to people struggling with mental well-being, we want to help them develop well. So this fundamental question of how the mind develops is really important, and I'll ask you, and I've been lecturing a bit now, so I always have to make a qualifier. For those of you who help people develop in education or psychotherapy or other fields related to mental health, besides lectures I've given, in your formal training, how many actually had a lecture that defined what the mind is? Raise your hands. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people. Okay, that's pretty good. So 9 out of about 450 people is, who's good at math? What percentage is that? Small. Right? That's a small percentage. Is it 2%? Okay, 2%. No, I think it's less than that. 45 would be 10%, so 22 would be 5%, and then 11, well, yeah, it's about small, 2%. Now, let's ask the question, how many of you think that that's weird? That those of us, including myself, trained in helping the mind develop, have never had even one lecture defining what the mind is, and it turns out that that 2% is true everywhere I've ever taught. Throughout the globe, throughout every profession you can imagine, it's around 2 to 5% of those of us helping people's minds develop have ever had in our formal training a definition of the thing we're helping develop. And you could then ask the next question, which is, how many have had a lecture defining what mental health is? And we could, for fun, do that. And you can raise your hand. So it's a bit more, but it'll take me more. It looks like about maybe 30 people or so. So that's a lot more, and that's great. So that's getting closer to 8%. But again, it's usually around 2 to 5% of people. Now, this is now over 73,000 people I've asked this question to, all around the planet. So what do we make of that? That those of us in the field of helping people grow in their minds haven't paused to define the thing we're helping grow. I think it's a serious problem in all these different fields of education and mental health that we can actually correct. And so in the last 15 years, what I've been trying to do is begin with a scientific definition of the mind that's been agreed upon by scientists that I work with in various university settings, but in particular, one group setting, when I was the training director at UCLA in child psychiatry, I was running an interdisciplinary study group, and it had 40 scientists in it from many different disciplines of science like anthropology or linguistics, neuroscience, developmental psychology. And our goal was, in the beginning of the decade of the brain, which was the 1990s, to look at what was the connection between this thing called the brain and this thing called the mind. So to address that question, I was the facilitator of the group. These different scientists had to say, well, okay, what is the brain? And that's pretty easy. You have a picture of it up here on the slide. The brain is this stuff in your skull, which we'll get into a lot of detail about later on. Okay, well, that's pretty straightforward. Then what's the mind? And we went around the room with these 40 people, and there was no agreement. And people got very angry with each other and frustrated and maybe even embarrassed. These weren't therapists. They really weren't talking about their feelings so much, but, this was the feeling in the room. And so the group didn't look like it was going to last very long because no one could talk to each other. There was no language in which these different sciences could speak to each other. So I was thinking, what could be something that these 40 people would agree upon? And the definition that I offered to them, based on what I knew from science, is the following definition, that amazingly, these 40 people who were ready to fight things out all agreed upon this definition. So here it is. The mind can be defined as a process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Period. The mind can be defined as a process that regulates the flow of energy and information. And when we got into it, and since I've been lecturing about this, people often say, well, doesn't the internet have a mind? And so it's a really good question. So a tree might not have a mind, although tree huggers get really mad when I say that. So we can then define the human mind. So the human mind would have two extra words to it. You'd say the human mind is an embodied, meaning it's in the body, and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. So the same definition, only we're being a little more specific. So, but in that specificity, we have a really, really interesting invitation to connect things that go on in the body with things that go on in our relationships. So as you'll see, bless you, as you'll see when we go through this, these 3 points of mind that regulates energy and information flow, the brain, which is the physical substrate in which the mechanisms of flow occur, and relationships, which is the sharing of energy and information, those 3 points, mind, brain, and relationships, form 3 points of a triangle of human experience that we're going to be discussing over and over again. And by the end of this morning, I hope you'll see that there's actually a triangle of well-being where each of these 3 points, a healthy mind, a healthy brain, and a healthy relationship set that we have, actually mutually interact with each other. So the first point is to say that these 3 entities, mind, brain, and relationships, are not reducible to each other. If you had a straightforward brain scientist up here, she or he might say to you, the mind is just the activity of the brain. And I'm here to tell you that that is absolutely not true. That, in fact, the process that regulates the energy and information flow in many ways uses the brain to create itself. And the brain is a slave to the mind. But, in fact, the mind is also shaped by the structure and function of the brain. So the arrows on this triangle we have of human experience are going in all directions. So relationships shape the mind shapes relationships. Relationships shape the brain shapes relationships. The brain shapes mind shapes the brain. So if you draw this triangle with each of those 3 points, the arrows go in all those directions. So we think about this multi-directional arrowed triangle, then we're really ready in the most basic of ways to start addressing questions like, how is the quality of life shaped by our brain structure that we've inherited genetically? How is it shaped by the brain structure that we've experientially been carving out? How does the mind influence the brain? Can you use the power of the mind to actually change the structure of the brain? And how do relationships support the development of a healthy mind and a healthy brain? And all these go together. So it gives us a tool to not be reductionistic in a way that actually is quite not only unhelpful, but as you may recall from the beginning of this decade, actually quite destructive. Because a number of very famous scientists with Nobel Prizes and fancy endowed professorships at fancy universities, some of which I attended, will go around telling people or writing books or publishing papers that said that parents have no influence on children. And any program that uses community funds to try to support relationships and families are wasting their money, right? These are Nobel Prize winners who would say this. So the issue became very, not just an academically important one, because if you believe that wasn't the truth, then non-truth was being spoken. But more importantly, people who needed help were having funding removed to them because of this genetic arrogance that these people were saying that genes determined all of how the brain was structured, which determined all of how the mind functioned, which determined whether someone was doing well or not. So it became more than just an academic discussion. If you believe in trying to help the world be a better place, which is certainly what drives me to do all this traveling away from my family, it's the idea that we can be solidly grounded in science, bring that to the public and to professionals, and then have funds placed where they need to be placed in ways that can truly be effective in helping people. So this triangle then gets us out of the reductionism that's not only wrong but destructive. And it's something you can use at cocktail parties if you happen to be hanging around with these scientists and point out the error of their ways before they get too drunk to remember what you convinced them of. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. Okay, so we're going to then start this morning's diving in experience with mind, brain, and relationships. And I hope by the end of this initial segment, you'll have a feeling in your bodies about this triangle, so it isn't something you just have to remember from a lecture, but it becomes kind of a part of a new worldview. When this group that I ran in the early 90s, 1991, it started for 5 years, it ran, happened, we were very interested from a scientific point of view of really exploring this notion of how the mind and brain were connected to each other. But one of the things that was striking then was that relationships were not really spoken about. And in the late 90s, what I tried to do was, as a therapist and as a father, really think how this decade of the brain could embrace the unbelievable importance of relationships. But somehow it wasn't the major focus of our work in that study group. So in the late 90s, it became clear, not initially in the brain science, but later on in the brain science, that one way of bringing relationships in was to realize that the brain, in fact, is the social organ of the body. The brain is the social organ of the body. So while indeed it processes information and it regulates your heart and allows you to remember things and stuff like that, it is fundamentally a social organ. And we're going to start with the brain in many ways because it's easier, but in this triangle we could start anywhere. And the relational aspect of our triangle is central because, in fact, the very essence of the way the brain develops is based on relationships. And we'll get into that now. So, the brain. The brain is formally defined as a collection of neurons in your skull, but we're going to use the term in its broadest use, which is to think about the nervous system that's distributed throughout the entire body. Now, we could say that instead of brain, but it's just not so easy to remember. The nervous system extended throughout the entire body. I mean, it's just cumbersome and wastes time. So you need to know when I say the word brain, I don't mean to limit it to the tissue in the skull, but everything in the skull, these neurons we're going to talk about, are distributed throughout the entire body, all the way down to your toes, surrounding your intestines, going around your heart. And poets knew this long before neuroscientists did, that in fact things going on in your heart are profoundly important for processing information. So the brain as a distributed nervous system throughout the whole body is what we're going to talk about first. So what is this brain? Well, the basic cell of the brain is the the nerve cell, sometimes called a neuron. And the neuron has a cell body where the genetic material is held, and it is, you mind if I walk away from the podium? Can you still hear me if I'm over here? Okay, so it has a cell body. Well, I guess I need to stay in the light. Let me see if I can come over here. I actually like walking down in the audience, but then always what happens is I get feedback from the people in the back that say that wasn't fair. And I totally respect, because you can't see me, so I'm going to try to stay in the light. Am I in the light? No, I'm not in the light. All right, so I'm behind the podium. All right, so I have to raise my arm, and I want to apologize. I broke this arm a few months ago, so it doesn't move so well, but I'll do my best. So you have I know what I can do. Watch this. Okay, me and the flowers. This is great. You know, before I get started on the brain cell, I was eating breakfast in the beautiful Darling house, and having breakfast, and there's this gorgeous tangerine tree right next to the breakfast area, and this beautiful little bird came to the tangerine tree, and then through the tangerine tree there were these gorgeous flowers from another plant. So he alighted on one of the leaves and then leaned over and started taking in the pollen from the flower. And it was just the most amazing thing to see life unfold like that. And just to imagine, you know, how the pollen in his beak will now be taken to another flower when he flits around and goes to some other part of the garden, the beautiful garden there, and we'll be allowing life to unfold. You know, and it's an old saying that my dear colleague Jon E used to always say, who unfortunately just passed away 2 months ago now, that it's just so amazing to be alive. You know, it's just incredible. So what we're going to get into a lot of details and a lot of science, it's just an amazing gift that we all have to be here. And it's so much. So these little things we know about birds and pollen, and these slightly invisible things that we've discovered about neurons, just illuminate this miraculous world that we can live in and come to deepen our understanding about. And as we do this, it's not to burden us with facts about neurons, but as you'll see, the goal of this is to understand the truth and then to see how to promote well-being in the world. That's the idea. Truth and the promotion of well-being. So I used to have, when I first started being a teacher, about one PowerPoint slide for every 90 seconds, right? So for an hour talk, you know, that would be like about 40 slides or something. And for today's talk, you'd have, 150 slides or whatever. And we'd race through and everybody would be sweating, and invariably someone would have a question and we'd get engaged in a discussion, and then I wouldn't have time to finish all the slides and people would be really mad. You know, why didn't you finish the slides? You know, you left 2 out, as if they couldn't read them. And then I would attend lectures and I'd see people reading their PowerPoint slides, and I would go, why am I here? I don't mean just why am I alive on the planet, but I mean, like, why am I here in this lecture? I could read this at home, you know, petting my dog. So I stopped using PowerPoint slides. Some of you may have been there. The moment I got up, actually, there were 1,200 people in the audience, and I got up with a set of slides, and I said, I can't do this anymore. And I turned the projector off, and I said, let me just talk to you. And that's what we did. And ever since that moment, I've never used extensive slides. I mean, we'll have pictures, but that's it. So what I want to say is that if you don't want to write anything down in your notepads that you have, that's beautiful. If you want to write lots of things down, that's great. This is all, I hope, going to be an experience for you that when you leave after the presentation, you'll feel like life is perhaps a little bit different in your perspective. That's the goal. So we're going to talk a lot about details, but the details aren't so much important as the feeling in your body about all this stuff. That make sense? Okay. So the neuron has a cell body, you know, with all the DNA in it and the genetic material, and it has a long length that usually sticks out better than this arm can. This is good physical therapy. This arm that sticks out this way, and this long length is called the axon, and the axon meets at another cell's receiving end called the dendrite, And the point is that they meet each other at the synapse. And there's a communication of neurotransmitters that allow the downstream neuron to either fire off or be inhibited from firing off. And that's the whole idea, is that you have a balance of excitatory versus inhibitory transmitters that are released. And when we talk about a phrase called neural firing, it means this flow of electrical energy down the long axon length, the release of transmitter, and either the firing off, that is the electrical current of ions flowing in and out of the membrane of the downstream neuron, called the postsynaptic, after the synapse neuron. That's the essential idea, right? Now, that would be super simple, even though it's a little complicated, if we didn't think about the numbers, but how many neurons are in the skull part of the brain? 100 billion. And George has given me a little extra time, and we're going to review each one of the neurons right now. No, that would take a long time. Now, if I'm an average neuron, and my kids say I'm below average because they're adolescents, so it's, but if I were an average neuron, how many other neurons would I directly connect to synaptically? Well, there's at least one, right? Maybe two? Do I hear three? I'm sure someone's done an auction in this room before. Do I hear four? Okay. The average number of connections, if I'm an average neuron, synaptic connections, is 10,000. 10,000. Now, you're sitting around round tables, and let's say you were having dinner, and the person to your left might want to have a conversation with you. The person to the right might want to have a conversation with you, maybe adjacent to that, so that'd be 4 people. Then maybe the 2 people across, so that might be 6 people would want to have a conversation with you and influence the nature of your energy and information flow, right? Well, think about being a neuron where you were sitting around a table with 10,000 other people neurons that wanted to have influence on what you were doing. This is why they call us neurotic. Because there's all this stuff going on. It's amazing that it even works, right? And there's a very well-known neuroscientist who said that the brain is so complicated, it staggers its own imagination. So you need to have your head examined to try to then look at the brain to relate it to the mind of all things, which wasn't even defined. So what are we doing here? Well, if we look at the brain as a system, a very complicated system, sure, but a system that, as you'll see, I think is extremely understandable, though it's a fascinating mystery. There's enough that's understandable when you look at it as a system that you can ask questions like, what's the connection between the neural functioning on the one hand and functionings in our relationships like love and empathy and compassion, or like things about the mind, like how you think or how you feel, or whether you want to be alive or not want to be alive, or whether you decide to commit your life to helping others, or whether you just want to accumulate material wealth. All these different questions about the mind can in fact be related to the brain and relationships. And we can look at our triangle to really understand this larger system of mind, brain, and relationships. So what I'm going to do for you now, keeping my own mind on top of time issues, is talk to you very briefly about the development of the nervous system, and to talk about some of the different parts of the nervous system. And we're going to start with a kind of a philosophical point, which some of you may know and some of you may not, but here's how it goes. Once upon a time, there was a sperm and an egg. 2 separate entities, right? Half a genome in each, and they got together and formed one conceptus, where the 2 halves of a genetic set of material become one. And that philosophical issue of 2 becoming one is an extremely important starting place for all of us. Now, the next philosophical point is that this single cell organism becomes 2 cells as it divides. 2 become 4, 4 become 8, 8 becomes 16. You probably think it's a math class, but 16 becomes 32, etc. And the conceptus becomes so big that certain of the cells are now on the outside of this big glob, and certain cells are on the inside. And here's the reason I'm bothering with all this initial development, is that the outer cells, these cells which will become our skin, are called the ectoderm, the outer layer, the ectoderm. And if you put your fingers together like this, where your fingernails are together, and you bring your fingernails inward toward the center of your palms like that, and let your knuckles curl over each other, notice where the fingernails got to. These outer ectodermal cells got to the inside. And that is the origin of our entire nervous system. Our nervous system began as ectodermal cells that were at the interface of the outer and the inner. They moved inward, and in their migration, they retained their philosophical place of always being about connecting the inner with the outer. And everything the nervous system does, in many ways, is about this connection between inner and outer. And so when we say that the brain is the social organ of the body, it's a natural emergence when we realize the origin of our neural cells is actually the interface between the outer and the inner. And that's why we're not built to just be living in a cave by ourselves, even though we may choose to. We're actually built to be incredibly social creatures, interacting with one another. And as you'll see when we talk about the emergence of the mammalian nervous system, we became incredibly sophisticated social creatures. Okay, so this now system where the neural tube is formed starts extending outward. The neural tissue then starts really placing itself throughout the entire body, in the limbs, in the organs called viscera, the hollow organs like the intestine, the heart, the lungs. And then a clump of it is up at the top called our skull, and in this cluster there is a ballooning out of the neurons there. And genetic material will determine the basic architecture of the brain itself. So we know for a fact that the information embedded in our DNA, our genetic material, determines the basic scaffolding around which the nervous system will grow. So if you've ever seen a building built up from scratch, you know there'll be blueprints, which is the genetic material, and then you'll start putting the foundation in and laying down the basic walls that will be there. And that's what genetic information does. But when we fix up the inners of the house and we shape it and give it its tone, that's a combination of this basic genetic blueprint along with the other important dimension that molds the structure of our nervous system, which is experience. That experience shapes the structure of the brain. And that's an absolute fact. And the way experience does that is now known to some degree, which is that experience, whenever you hear the word experience, it means neural firing. Neural firing is the inner part of the word experience, what that means, neural firing. And when neurons fire together, the old saying from Donald Hebb from over 50 years ago is neurons which fire together wire together. Right? So if you've been bitten by a cat when you're 6 months of age, you will have certain perceptual systems that saw the cat, perceptual systems that felt the bite on your hand, the fear, the pain, all go together because the neurons which are firing together wire together. And Eric Kandel, a psychiatrist, won the Nobel Prize for proving that neurons firing together actually turn the genetic material on in one of the cells that allow protein to be produced. That's what genes do, is they allow protein production. Proteins to be produced, so you strengthen the connection of existing synapses, or you create new ones. And later on, even, it's been discovered that experience can also lead to the reproduction of brand new neurons. So the two ways experience shapes our development is through this thing called synaptogenesis, that is the genesis of either new synapses or the strengthening of old ones. That's one thing. But then there's neurogenesis. We know that there are uncommitted cells, little blobs in the skull, and that certain experiences like novelty can stimulate the daughter cell of this neural stem cell to actually differentiate and become a fully elaborated neuron in the brain. Within 1 month, it gets sort of setting itself up, and by 3 months, it's a fully established new neuron in the brain. And this happens not only in childhood and adolescence, but throughout our adulthoods. It's this notion that you change synaptic connections and you may even grow new neurons throughout the lifespan that allows us to do things like lifelong learning or psychotherapy. And my oldest patient is in his 90s, and he changed so much in the process of therapy. His wife said to me, "Did you give my husband a brain transplant?" And I said, no, he was just doing the work he needed to do with his mind to actually change his brain into his 90s. So what we need to do then in education and psychotherapy is think about how we can inspire people to rewire their brains. That's the whole idea. How do you inspire and rewire so that if the wiring for genetic reasons wasn't so good, or experiential reasons, or just random reasons, how can we get a sense of that and try to move it in a positive direction? Sometimes it's possible and sometimes it's not, but at least we can give it our best effort. And from a community point of view, how do we provide the kind of resources necessary to allow the relationships that shape those experiences to be promoting well-being? So that's the basic idea. So when we get to the specifics of it, what we find is that the lower parts of the nervous system develop earlier, and then as we move literally upward, gravity-wise upward, those develop later. So we're going to now go through a very quick neuroanatomy lesson, so we're all on the same page about this. Let me see if this has a yeah, no, what I'm trying to do is get an arrow, but maybe it doesn't. It looks like it has a laser beam. Let me just see here. No, that's definitely not what I want. Okay, George, I'm going to ask you to help me out here. But he's out somewhere. Okay. Can someone fish around with the computer and turn it on while is someone comfortable with it? If you just try to get it back to the slide, that would be great. There's an arrow, yeah. You know, maybe I'll come down there. Would you mind if I go down for a moment? So, the idea is that the lower parts develop first. And let's see, we don't want this, we want this right here. There we go. Okay, so the idea is that the lower parts develop first, and the higher parts will be relatively underdeveloped. Let's see if I can get this bigger. Nope. There we go. Okay, this is fine. And down here you would have the lower part of the brain, the spinal cord that's connecting all or most of the distribution of the neurons in the body, and it comes up here, and this lower part here is the brain stem, the first part of the brain we'll talk about. Then there's a middle area that's sort of embedded behind this zone here called the limbic area. That's the second area of the brain we'll talk about. And then as we move upward, we're talking about the neocortex right here. Let me get rid of that. So those are the three areas we're now going to talk about. Brainstem, limbic area, and the cortex. And now that you've seen that, we can then go and look at a hand model of the brain. So we have placed a model of the brain under each of your chairs. So if you reach beneath the chair with your hand and pick up your hand, here it is, it's your hand. So if you put your thumb in the middle and you put your fingers over the top, this is a very handy model of the brain. So the spinal cord is here in your wrist. And if you lift your fingers up, lift your thumb up, the first part of the brain we're talking about, the brain stem, is there in your palm. Then if you put your thumb over, most of us just have one thumb, there's actually a left and right. Here, this is your limbic area represented by your thumb. And then the topmost part of the brain is the neocortex or cerebral cortex. That's the outer bark of the brain. And we're going to go over this because to understand well-being, we need to understand how this all works together as a system. So let's just go over it briefly. The first part to develop in utero is the brain stem. And this is the most basic part of the skull part of the brain that helps to regulate the body by influencing heart rate and respiration. It also has clusters of cells in it that are responsible for the fight, flight, freeze, survival response. And this region of the brain regulates our state of alertness or sleepiness. So hopefully your brain stems are keeping you awake if I'm doing my job. Now this develops very well and is also part of what are called motivational systems that work closely with, if you put your thumb down, the limbic areas of the brain. And these areas evolved when we became mammals over 200 million years ago, way over 200 million years ago. And this mammalian limbic area then is somewhat developed at birth, but will be continuing to develop and influenced therefore by experience as well as genetics after birth. The limbic areas are important for helping mediate or create or facilitate at least 5 processes, the first of which is it works with the brain stem in determining our motivational drives, like for exploration or mastery, for play, for resource allocation, for things like reproduction, satisfying drives for hunger. These basic motivational systems in animals is thought to be this limbic brainstem combo. So we have motivational circuits are established with the brainstem. We also have systems of creating emotion, which is a term that also we could spend an entire day on. Let's just call it affect, feelings like anger or fear and other affective states are mediated in this limbic area. You also have a third thing, so we have motivation, we have emotion. A third thing is that it's very important for appraising the meaning of things. It's like if someone says life is meaningless, you know there's something not working properly in this limbic area that appraises that something is meaningful. This is important to me. Okay, so that's a third area of appraisal of meaning. A fourth is it helps distinguish different kinds of memory. So there's an area of this limbic zone called the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is very important for elaborating memory in ways we'll talk about later, but just in distinguishing different kinds of memory. Like if you're bitten by that kitten when you were 6 months of age, you only have a certain kind of memory that's in your body and in your feelings, not in the kind of memory called explicit memory, where you have a sense that it's a fact or a sense of yourself in time. And this is a part of the limbic hippocampal function. So that's number 4, memory. And number 5, that the limbic area is essential for, is our relationships with each other. And so you really don't see these sophisticated, interpersonally dependent relationships happen until the mammalian stage has been achieved. And that's because, bless you, the limbic area is essential for that. Okay? So we have those 5 functions of motivational states, affective states, memory differentiation, appraisal of meaning, and attachment. Okay, and for those of you who like to know the names of these areas, the amygdala is part of the limbic area, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus, and other areas around those regions. Okay, so that's our mammalian heritage, and you have a right and left. And then when we became primates, we also developed this outer bark of the brain. If you put your fingers over the top, this is the neocortex. So the cortex sits on top of the limbic area, which is sitting on top of the brainstem. And it has two sides as well. The right and left are very different from each other. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in general, the cortex is for creating more abstract information, like perception. And the back of the brain, from these second knuckles backward to the back of your hand, and here would be the person's eyes, and the front of your knuckles, top of the head here. This back part of the brain, there and there, in general, the way of just remembering it is the back part of the brain is for perception, like hearing and seeing, sensing different aspects of touch in your body. These are all the back of the brain areas. And then the front of the brain developed a lot when we became primates, this frontal lobe of the brain. And interestingly, from a philosophical point of view, the back of the brain in many ways is the closest to the physical world. It literally develops first, and then as we move forward in development after birth, the front part of the brains will be developing later. And as you move toward the front, you get further away from the physical world. So the back of the brain is creating perception of the physical world. Then when you get toward this frontal part, these second knuckles downward, the first part is the part that allows you to carry out interactions with your body in the physical world. So it's the motor area. And then just in front of that is a premotor area, meaning it's where you plan motor action. But then when you get to these last fingernails, last knuckles, and the only fingernails you have, down there, that's called the frontmost part of the frontal lobe, otherwise known as the prefrontal cortex. And once you've gotten to the prefrontal cortex, which is developed hugely in humans, in fact, you could call it our cortex humanitas. It's what distinguishes us from all other creatures on the planet, for good and for bad reasons. And it is the most distinct in terms of its being anchored in the physical world, meaning it's not very anchored in the physical world. It can imagine all sorts of things like the future. Think about the past. It can think about concepts like the mind, or think about freedom, or justice. This prefrontal cortex is so far from the physical world that it has freed us up to build buildings like this, to get into long cylindrical things and fly through space, to pick up a little square object and chat with someone in China. I mean, that's pretty wild if you think about it. You know, if someone would have told you 30 years ago you're going to pick up a little object and chat with someone in China for free, you know, I don't think you'd probably think they were crazy, right? It's like the Jetsons, you know, but we're living in that world now, and this is all because of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex can assemble all sorts of things from the physical world and extract away from them things far away from that. Let's talk about one important topic which the prefrontal cortex can do, which my kids are always asking me about. We have a lot of animals that we live with, usually invited, and some of those animals are dogs, others are fish and frogs and things. But the dogs, my kids are always saying, well, what are they thinking about? And my daughter asked recently, do our dogs think about the fact that they're going to die? And I said, well, they don't have a prefrontal cortex to speak of. I mean, I love them and everything, but they just don't. And so they're probably not thinking about death. They probably can't even think about something abstract like that. They're probably just feeling a desire to eat kibble. This is one of our dogs in particular. The other one just wants to be hugged. That's his thing. They're very different, the two of them. But we have the burden and maybe even the responsibility because of our prefrontal cortex, to understand that we don't live forever, and to think about things like, why are we here on the planet? Do we want to spend time just hurting people or helping people? What are the choices we have? And in many ways, the prefrontal cortex gives us this choice because it's free to actually reflect on itself. It's a profound part. And this area of the brain, we believe, is significantly shaped by our relationships with our caregivers early in life. It's certainly influenced by genetics as well. And these two go together in this dance that goes on forever. Because whenever we say an experience shapes the structure of the brain, you know now from having learned the mechanism that it's doing that by the activation of genes. So we never separate genes from experience. They're always interacting with each other. Okay, so what we want to then do is ask the question, how does the mind relate to all this, and how does this shaky brain up there? That's kind of something. I bet people are in the coconut grove and see that even when there's no wind blowing on a slide. So what do relationships have to do with it? Well, here's just the essence thing, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions before we take a break in 10 minutes. The essence is this, that energy and information flow that are shared is the way we communicate with each other. This sending of signals from one human being to another stimulates the firing of neurons. And the way energy and information is flowing and regulated, that's the mind, in many ways is then dancing among the firing patterns in the brain. So to say it in another way, the mind rides along the neural firing patterns in the brain. And as energy information then is passed from one human being to another, this energy and information transfer is mutually resonating, is mutually influencing the firing patterns of someone else. So we know actually now from neuroscience the basic cellular processes that allow us to become attuned to each other. And just to give you an experiential on that, I'll do something and then you can see how you feel. So just watch me for a moment. Just you can put your pens down, just watch me, and just see how you feel, especially those of you who've never seen me do this before. Okay, so just remember how you felt then. Now notice how you feel this time. Did anyone feel anything the second time? What did you feel? Thirsty. Exactly. So how about the first time? Nothing. So when there is an act with intention, there are a set of neurons, they happen to be called mirror neurons, but it doesn't matter the name of them, but these mirror neurons are picking up sequences of action that have predictable outcomes. So it's a pattern detector. And the pattern is that when I did this without a bottle, you had no idea what I was doing. But when I had a bottle in my hand, you could detect my mind. Your mirror neuron groupings actually work with other areas of the brain that we'll talk about to create a map of my mind. And that's called intention. So we know the mirror neurons are very important for creating maps of the intentions of others. We also have now established that they are crucial for creating maps of the internal state of another, like their feelings. And they do this actually by transmitting that information from the cortex where perception happens downward into the limbic areas, the brainstem, and the body. And for short, we're going to call those the subcortical areas. So the limbic area, brainstem, and body are beneath the cortex. So it's called beneath cortical cortex. So these perceptual cortical processes perceive a pattern that's detected as intentional or an emotional state, push that information downward to the subcortical, limbic, brainstem, and body, and then our bodies and brainstems and limbic areas resonate with what we see. And you become thirsty because I'm drinking. If a child sees the internal state of love and the intention to do good with that child, the child will pick up that intention and feel that warmth. And vice versa, if kids pick up hostility and anger, even though a parent is trying not to show it, the mirror neuron groupings will actually embed that in the internal experience of the child. This is without words being spoken to that, it's just the picking up of intentional states. So we know that this nervous system is literally hardwired to detect the mind of someone else, the energy and information flow and its regulation, like intentions, thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs. All of that is the stuff of the mind. Those are ways that energy and information is regulated. And we have neural cells that now have been determined in the last 10 years that actually pick up the internal state of another person. So when we say the phrase, the brain is the social organ of the body, it's not just trying to be, funny or not funny, but whatever. It's based in absolute science. These neural tissues are tuned in to the interpersonal world. So what we know, and we're going to get into this a lot after the break, is that certain areas of the brain that the mind uses to create functions like insight and empathy and regulating one's own internal state and even morality are directly shaped by what you do with your mind and also what happens in relationships. So we're going to build on this whole framework to try to really go deeply into the idea of, okay, what is mental health? What are the experiences that are needed to harness all of this mind-brain relationship interaction to promote well-being? How can we understand that so that we can lay a foundation scientific foundation for what we can do to help ourselves, people in our immediate circles, and then, as Einstein would say, how we widen our circles of compassion so that we actually realize we're part of a global community and try to really bring this into the world. So let me say there's a microphone over there, and if there are questions, we have time now to address them before we take our break. And if there are no questions, now, is that because it was so confusing, and so you can't even imagine asking a question, or so clear? Or okay, if there is a question, there's a mic over there, and I think there are people coming up, so good. Please.
Hi.
And if you are going to get up and go to the restroom, which is fine, just please try to do it with a low energy and information transfer. Yes.
I was really struck by your rapture in describing the bird and the tangerine tree.
Can you speak a little more slowly and into the mic?
Is
please.
this better?
Yes.
I was very struck by your rapture in describing the bird and the tangerine tree and the color of the flowers. And I share that rapture in the natural world, and it strikes me that when I'm out in the natural world, that world is part of my mind, because although there may not be an intent on the part of the bird or the leaf on the tree to communicate something to me, that there's energy there that I respond to.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I don't know if you'll be addressing this later. It strikes me that our minds go well beyond what is peripheral to our bodies in terms of
Right, so
embodied.
that's the relational part of it, absolutely. I agree with that totally. You have a relationship with nature. Absolutely.
Is it in your thought, in your thinking, is it that relationship has to be a mutual relationship, or that a one-sided relationship extends into mind outside of us?
Well, that's a really good point. You know, I think we have a mutual relationship with nature. I guess the idea of relationship would be mutual. It doesn't have to be symmetric, but I mean, that bird is, in fact, hanging out at a tree. I don't know if the Darlings planted it, but certainly planted by someone, a human being. And so there's a mutuality there, and there's a larger sense of presence, you know, that we'll talk about later on, of realizing that there are so many invisible, woven tapestries that we're a part of that we can pull away from and just say, oh yeah, I'm just going to stay in my room and be by myself. But the fact is, these invisible senses of being interconnected are there, and I think sometimes when we allow ourselves to get into a state of awareness of our interconnection, that rapture happens, not because we're creating it, but just we're becoming receptive to it. And I think it's incredibly important for well-being that we embrace the presence of these invisible realities. And that's a whole other thing we'll get into, but I really appreciate your question. Thank you. Yes?
Could you differentiate between the experience of well-being and the experience of joy or happiness?
Yeah, when we get to the afternoon, not the afternoon, we get to the next one after the break, let me address that question then. Yeah, thank you.
What do you think about Dr. Pierce's assertion that if you don't grow up with safety, love, and creativity, that you don't even develop the other two parts of the brain, that you stay in the reptilian brain? And he connected that with sort of gang connection to their motivation. I don't want to go there. Anyway, yeah. But anyway, do you agree with that?
You know, I'm not sure the details of his point there, but what I would say is that I think it's more complicated than that. We have a center at UCLA called the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. You know, it's the way in which culture shapes our development across the lifespan is incredibly important. It's not as simple as if you don't have something then this one little thing doesn't develop. And I think when we get into that after the break, it'll become a little more clear about that. But I do think it is important to realize, and maybe this is what his issue is, I don't know, but in fact that these lower parts of the brain, the brainstem is sometimes called the reptilian part of the brain, the limbic area called the old mammalian part, they do have extremely powerful influences on the cortical processes that we usually think of as in charge, you know, these higher human processes. So in that sense, the basic issue, I do agree with, it's a very important one, that in fact these subcortical processes can take over a person's life and lead to destructive experiences no matter what the person rationally thinks or is consciously aware of. And so in that sense, that's extremely important. Genetically, that can occur, as well as experientially, as well as culturally shaping those experiences through lots of different forces. So that's a very important point. Thank you. Now, are you lined up for questions? Or yes, thank you.
You were talking about empathy, and
Can you speak into the mic and slowly?
Yes, you were speaking about the development of empathy.
Yeah, can you hear? Okay.
You were speaking about the development of empathy, and I was wondering about the projective processes, how that's different.
Projective processes?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me see if it's a great question, and it would take me about 3 minutes to answer it, which I'm happy to do. Are people okay waiting a little bit longer? Yeah. Okay. So we talked about this mirror neuron. Here's one way of thinking about it. This is the neurobiology of empathy, and then we'll think about the projective process. In the neurobiology of empathy, what we think is going on is that the mirror neuron groupings in the cortex work with this area in the temporal lobe to actually create a map of another person's intentional state. These maps then go down an area called the insula and lead to this limbic brainstem body resonance. And so that would be the basis for compassion, or what a patient of mine used to call feeling felt, when you feel like another person feels you. Then that information in the subcortical areas, body, brainstem, and limbic area, comes back up through the insula and deposits itself in an area of the brain we're going to talk about after the break, in this middle part behind your forehead, the middle part of the prefrontal cortex. And you basically have what's called interoception. That is, you're having a perception of your own interior world. Then as you get a map of your own interior world, you are thought to make an attribution that this interior state that I'm feeling is likely happening because of what I'm seeing in that person. It's there where you can confuse that empathic imagination with projection. Where, like, if I'm, let's say, in a session with a patient and I'm feeling angry because they're actually raising something I didn't work out with my own father or something, and I say to them, "Oh, well, you're angry," and they go, "I'm not angry, I'm really sad." Then I have now projected my anger that I'm having because they're actually reminding me of something that's irritating me, and I've confused it with empathy, and I've projected, and so I've made a false attribution. And this happens all the time, especially with young therapists and older therapists, and it's really a matter of being very open to the fact that we're all human. But from a parenting point of view, parents who have not worked through their own issues, and in the Developing Mind I talk about this, and actually next week we're having an entire conference on this topic about the adult attachment interview, which explores a parent's own state of mind. And in many ways, what can distort a child's upbringing is when parents haven't worked through their own experiences from their childhoods, and they do project into the relationship reflections to the child that are more about the parent's history rather than what's actually going on with the child, and the child gets very confused by it, and can take in another person's reality as if it's their own, and that kind of projection developmentally can be quite distorting. So does that help address the question?
Yes,
Okay,
and that
great.
happens with societies as well.
And societies as well, you betcha, and even presidents sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do one more. Is that a whole line up there? You know, I'm just mindful of the time, so I don't know. Are you guys lined up for questions? I probably should take one more question just for the time's sake, and then we'll take. Please line up first when we come next. Yes.
Thank you. When you start talking about the mirroring process, I start thinking about the construct of self. And
The construct of self.
self, yeah, which you didn't mention in the interplay between brain, mind, and relationships. So I guess I start thinking, once you start talking about the kind of mirroring beyond thirst, where it's love or attention, or I'm curious what you would say about where does the construct of self come into that?
Yeah, you know, we will be addressing that after the break, and it's a great question about self, and that will be one of the top main topics.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's take a break, and let's try to come back in 10 minutes. Can we do a 10-minute break? So at 10:35.
Do you need anything?